And we're going to begin with 3 stages of trial this morning, by the way. Let me see if this works. Yeah. Here is where we are on the notes. We're on, Friday, I'm calling a day of messianic perfection. And obviously what I have in mind there is Jesus on the cross announcing it is finished. The work is accomplished. So Friday is primarily remembered, and appropriately so, as the day of Jesus' crucifixion and death and burial. But before the crucifixion, there was a series of trials, and those trials are pretty carefully recorded for us. I say pretty carefully, majestically carefully, but my point is we have a good deal of detail in the Gospels, and we can reconstruct those. So that's where we're going to begin with the trials on Friday morning after Jesus was arrested late on Thursday outside of Gethsemane. The Jewish leadership has long since been enraged with Jesus. But because he is wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove, and because he catapulted himself so immediately into wild-eyed hero worship on the part of the people, the point is he was so much adored by the crowd. Now, it was shallow, it was superficial, it was self-serving, and Jesus knew it, and he's going to unmask it. But nonetheless, he utilizes the fact that he is the best show in town. And everywhere he goes, he has huge crowds. And to the Jewish leadership, those crowds are going to riot if they try and take him. So, Jesus, the Jewish leadership has got to get the Romans to do the dirty work of killing Jesus. They can't do it themselves. And they confess that. They can't do it themselves on 2 counts. Number 1, legally they are not given the right by Rome to execute. The Jews had a great deal of self-rule under Rome, but they could not. They could even condemn a man, but they could not execute a man. They were not allowed that. Now, you tell me, folks, I'm doing all the talking here. What does any problem come to your mind when I say the Jews were not allowed to execute? Does any of that spark any sort of a problem? Talk to me. Anybody? Pardon me? As in? Yeah, so whom did they stone? Stephen. That's the big problem. And this produces quite a problem in New Testament studies because on the one hand, the Bible is explicit, John 18, and history seems to be very, very clear that the Jews were not allowed to execute somebody, and yet they grabbed Stephen. Well, here's the point. Remember what the Roman responsibility was? The responsibility of the Roman officer, it was to keep the peace. And Stephen is a nobody. And if they want to grab him and haul him out behind a house and stone him, and it settles things down, fine. Jesus was wildly popular. See the point? So, on the one hand, it is true, I'm convinced, and I've done a good deal of study with it, that the Jews were not, the Jewish people, the officials were not allowed to execute. On the other hand, they might just spontaneously grab somebody and stone them to death if it wasn't going to cause a riot, and that would, the Romans would look the other way. So my point is, in order to get Jesus dead, the Jewish leadership has to get the Roman leadership to do that. Now, that's Pilate. Now, here's the thing. It seems like this would not be a difficult case to make because, now you got to hear me on this. I haven't talked to you about this before. But the fact is that Jesus did go up and down the countryside claiming to be Messiah. Messiah means, it's a many variegated concept, but above all things to the Jewish mind, it means king. And when they heard Jesus, and he meant it to be this way, claimed to be the Christ, that is New Testament for Old Testament Messiah. So when they heard him claiming to be the Messiah, they heard him claim to be king. The Romans would not tolerate pretender kings. I talked to you about this before, that the Romans had this vast empire, and they had sedition here and there, and they would not tolerate it. So here's the Jewish leadership thinking, we can easily make the case to Pilate that this man is a threat to Rome. Here you got these Jewish people, they're trouble all the time, and now you got this man going about claiming to be their king. You need to put him to death. He is a seditionist. And that's exactly what Rome did with seditionists. They had a special method of execution, which is called crucifixion, which they had fine-tuned to be rid. And let me tell you this. Well, I'll come back to it. But at any rate, the Jewish leadership, the Sanhedrin, is convinced that if they can get Jesus on trial before Pilate, that Pilate will be persuaded, will indeed determine that Jesus is a threat, a seditionist, a pretender king who needs to die. So that's the plot. Now, here's a little detail that's I'm laying a lot on you all of a sudden, but know this, that I have said to you before, folks, are you with me? That Jesus, throughout his ministry, claimed to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. He claimed to be. This was the claim he made everywhere he went. I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. This was sort of, John wrote a gospel, it's our Gospel of John, and in the end, he explains why he wrote the gospel. He says in John chapter 20 and verse 30, he says, many other signs did Jesus, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you might have life through his name. So what the basic, and this appears 4 other times in the Gospels, where Jesus specifically says, or the narrative, what Jesus claims concerning himself is he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I've told you before, by the way, this is a bit of an aside, forgive me, but it's hard for us to appreciate how bottomlessly difficult it would have been to believe those claims. But I'll just leave that alone for now. We take them for granted. They're easy for us. Jesus was a horrible disappointment as the Christ. We like a warrior Messiah, deliver us from Rome. And number 2, he is claiming to be God come in the flesh, which is on the face of it, horrible blasphemy, unless it just happens to be the truth. And it never had been the truth before in human history. It was unimaginable truth. So Jesus claims, though, now here's my point, though. Yes, Jesus, again and again, everywhere he went, he made the claim to be the Christ. But here's a little wrinkle. He was careful not to use the word Mashiach or Christos of himself. And the reason was because he knew he would just arm his enemies, his Jewish enemies. So what he did, now follow me on this. How you doing this morning? You look a little sleepy, to be honest with you. But what Jesus did, is he took to himself any number of Old Testament titles. What's Jesus' favorite title of himself? Do you know? What is it? Son of Man. 81 times in the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man. Where'd that come from? In Daniel chapter 7, one of the most blessed messianic passages of the Old Testament, you have 4 Gentile kingdoms, and then the Ancient of Days, God takes his throne, and there appears before him one like unto a Son of Man, and he's dispatched to be the 5th world, to establish the 5th world kingdom, and be the Messiah. So one of the titles of Messiah, which is most familiar to the Jewish people, is Son of Man. Jesus uses that all the time. So he takes titles, he takes passages, he reads Isaiah 61 and says, this day the scripture is fulfilled in your ears. Again and again, Jesus takes Old Testament figures and words and titles and so on that any Jewish ear would have heard as Messiah, but he doesn't use the word. And for that reason, the Jewish leadership is horribly frustrated when they are trying to make the case to Pilate, or they're preparing to make the case to Pilate, that he is a seditionist, because nobody remembers hearing him. He doesn't use the word Christos of himself. On the other hand, so here's the point. If Jesus again and again claims to be the Son of Man, and all the Jewish listeners here, he's claiming to be the Messiah of Daniel 7. So now Jesus' enemies go to Pilate and they say, this guy claims to be the Son of Man. What's Pilate going to say? Me too. Aren't we all, for heaven's sakes? So it's a Jesus was wise as a serpent, and it is a very deliberate strategy that he employs. So, on the one hand, Jesus has claimed to be the Messiah. On the other hand, the case is going to be very difficult to make on the part of the Jewish leadership. Now that sets us up for the 3 trials. So, all right. I started out to say, I got lost in that. Here's the thing. What you need to understand is you have this plot. We're going to have Jesus on the cross by the morning. It's all going to happen in the space of a night. We got everything set up. But first of all, the Jewish Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin has to meet to come up with an indictment. And then once they have a charge, and the charge is going to be, it has to be sedition, so we got to get him to confess he is a king, and because we don't have much testimony to the fact, then we're going to take him to Pilate. And Pilate is going to very quickly, this is the plan, just pretty perfunctorily try him and turn him over to be crucified. Now that's the plan, all right? So there's going to be, first of all, and you'll hear it spoken of a lot of times as the Jewish trials, then the Roman trials. Actually, the Sanhedrin is, it's not so much a trial as a hearing. It's sort of a grand jury. They're trying to come up with a credible charge that they can take to Pilate. And that's what's at stake in the Jewish trials. We're going to talk about them in just a minute. Then he is taken to Pilate with the anticipation that Pilate is just going to rubber stamp it and send him off to be crucified. It doesn't come out that way. But now, let me say one other thing with regard to these trials. So we're going to look at the Jewish trials, and this is in your notes quite clearly, and then the Roman trials. And there are stages to each one. I'll come to that. Know this, folks. I'm just going to say this and be done with it. But I have mentioned to you before, and I think you're probably familiar with it, there is a huge community of scholars of one stripe or sort of another whose business, whose life mission is to discredit the Scriptures. And they are the critical world. And when you hear that word critical, every time in a biblical study sense, when you're talking about the study of Scripture, and for my money, and you hear the phrase critical scholars, if you want to just sort it all out real quickly and get to the nub of it, substitute for the word critical the word anti-supernatural. That's what's at stake. They don't believe in the supernatural. It can't happen. They are to theology what uniformitarian biology is to uniformitarian evolution is to biology. In other words, their attitude is basically, if there's a God, we're not sure, but he stays home. He doesn't come down here in any sense. So there have never been any miracles. And so, at any rate, without spending any time with it, the point is that what the critical world, the anti-supernaturalist world, loves to do is find perceived errors or contradictions in the Bible. And guess what? The Gospels are their happy hunting grounds because you got four guys telling the same story. Now, let me just go on record. There is no error in all of those records. They are absolutely inerrant, and careful study will demonstrate that, although you don't embrace it because you can demonstrate it. You embrace it, and then you expect you study the Bible with that in mind. But the point is that where they will often go is the trials. And they will insist that the record in the four Gospels of the trials of Jesus are entirely incoherent. They can't be reconciled. There are all sorts of disparities and disagreements and contradictions. It's not true. And they fit perfectly. I'm going to point out some of those areas as we go. John 18 gives us as I say, the first stage. There are three stages to the Jewish hearings, and I really want you to get this. It's a little technical and pedantic, but it's hugely important to the integrity of the text. Listen, Jesus is arrested late on Thursday night, early Friday morning, somewhere around 11 to 12 at night, in Gethsemane. He is, as I pointed out to you before, brought back up on that western hill to the villa of the high priest. But when he arrives, again, you can imagine, understand the situation. The Sanhedrinists, 70 men, most of them elderly, in a culture where you don't do things at night, your body doesn't react well to this, but they have been told, listen, we think we've got him. Judas is on our side. He's going to tell us where to find him. So we think we're going to have him tonight. So be ready. So maybe they've come to the home of Caiaphas, and they're sleeping in various places. But now the soldiers actually appear with the prisoner Jesus, and all of a sudden they scurry to pull together the Sanhedrinists in a huge room to have a trial. And I think probably while they are scurrying about getting things ready, Jesus is hauled before Annas. Here is John's telling. John does not tell us about Gethsemane. He doesn't tell us that story. But he does say that Jesus has left the upper room, made his way down. This is Thursday night. And he says he went out with his disciples. And it's interesting that he says, over the brook Kidron. And the brook Kidron is that drainage ditch. And let me tell you something. That brook, because remember, this is Thursday night. Thursday afternoon, between the evenings, from about 3 o'clock till 7:30 at night, tens of thousands of lambs had been slain. Most of that blood is going to be drained into the Kidron. So the brook Kidron is undoubtedly running red with the blood of those sacrificial animals, and all of that is just a picture of what's going to happen to Jesus on the morrow. And I think it's significant that Jesus steps over the brook, but that's how you go. If you're going to go from the city of Jerusalem down the Kidron over to Gethsemane, you're going to step, you do today, though the brook is dry. The valley is about 60 feet filled in. But nonetheless, he steps over the brook Kidron where there was a garden. And then John tells us that Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. Let me just tell you this. I didn't mention yesterday that Gethsemane, and you can, when you go to Israel, those of you going to go to Israel in a few weeks, and the rest of you, when you get there, and get there for heaven's sakes, you'll go to Gethsemane. Now, most of the groups will just go into the garden. That's fine. I think it probably is the garden where Jesus prayed. On the other hand, there's a beautiful church there and so on, kind of gets in the way. But what people don't do is leave the garden, go down the street, through another lane, down the bottom of the hill, and through a bit of a corridor, because there's a cave. And that cave is part of the hill. In other words, it's all covered over today with streets and buildings and so on, but you can trace it easily. You go down to that cave. Now, today, that cave features a Catholic church, and there happens to be, forgive me, the most ornery padre there. I mean, this guy who stands there is just, he's kind of a grumpy guy. But he used to let us go in and actually teach there, but he won't let us do that anymore. But at any rate, I think it's good to go into that cave because here's the point. This Gethsemane, and let me say this about Gethsemane. I'm backing up too much. But Gethsemane, we talking about the garden. It's not like a garden. It's a hobby farm. It's actually an agricultural installation. You could not have any sort of agriculture inside the walled city of Jerusalem. So, and by the way, you couldn't bury inside the walled city. And so any walled city would be ringed all the way around with gardens and tombs, many times the tombs in the garden. And the garden, but you don't think of the garden as a rose garden. Think of it as a working agricultural installation. In this case, it was a olive oil production farm. And Gethsemane means olive press. So whoever owned this little farm, and it would have been hedged in and very private and so on, it's an industry. And whoever owns it had allowed Jesus access to it. And so when he would come with his disciples to Jerusalem, a good place to stay, it's hard to find a place to stay with 12 other guys, would be this cave where it was warm in the winter and cool in the summer and very private. And so Jesus and his disciples often went to this. That's why Judas, when he finds the room empty up on the hill, says, oh, I know where he must be, and takes him down to Gethsemane, all right? And John helps us here. But it says that, here it is, he having received a detachment of troops, that's the word cohort that I've talked to you about, and coming with lanterns, torches, and weapons, and therefore Jesus is arrested. Now, after he is arrested, the detachment of troops and the captain of the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus, bound him. By the way, the disciples all deserted Jesus. They fled. Peter followed afar off, you remember, but he kind of trailed behind. But again, what it says here is they led him away to Annas first. All right, now, very quickly, who is Annas? Well, he is the aged father-in-law of Caiaphas. He is a crook of the highest order. He has, for the better part of 30 years, had control of the high priestly office. Now, for a lot of that time, for a number of years, he was the high priest, but he was so crooked that the Romans got rid of him, but he was able to get, first of all, another son-in-law, and then this son-in-law in the office. So Annas, and again, I got to go back to it. You have this villa, and there are undoubtedly quarters and apartments and so on, and Annas has really been the power behind the throne as far as the high priestly office is concerned, so he undoubtedly has his own quarters there in the priestly villa. So here comes Jesus with the soldiers, and they're scurrying about to get all the Sanhedrinists in the great room so they can have what's going to be the trial, and just we're going to talk about it. But I think what happens is they said, Annas says, I want to interview him first. So the first stage of the trial is when Jesus appears before the man Annas, the aged sort of high priest emeritus, if you don't mind. Now, let me say this, and I want you to hear me. and this is a little bit delicate. In the process of this trial, listen, the Jewish people had, because it was based entirely on the Old Testament, had an amazingly just system of jurisprudence. They had all sorts of protocols and this is because God had told them back there in Deuteronomy chapter 10 that this law, including the law, the jurisprudence, how you try an accused criminal, the steps you take to determine the guilt or innocence of an accused person, and they were very proud of their protocols, and God had set those protocols in place. But here's the point. In the course of this trial, they're going to violate those protocols again and again. And it's a real embarrassment. And it's been used, that reality has been used as an excuse to persecute Jewish people down through the ages. That's wicked. But we've got to acknowledge that one of the most important protocols of you know what I'm saying, the rules, the canons by which they administered justice in the Jewish world, one of the most important was this, that you never have a trial at night. You couldn't have a trial between sundown and sunup. The reason is because, all right, what's the most basic jurisprudential protocol in the Old Testament? You all know it by heart. In the mouth of what? Can you go any further? In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every matter be established. Now that's a jurisprudence, it's a courtroom protocol, and what it means is you can't convict a man except with eyewitness testimony, and the eyewitness testimony has to be at least 2 and better 3. And you can't get witnesses in the middle of the night. This is why the judge normally sat in the gate of the city, because it's a bottleneck. You can get witnesses. So it was absolutely a violation of protocol to have this trial in the middle of the night. You couldn't have trials in a private home. It had to be in a public place. They violated that. So you can find lists of 20 or 30 specific ways in which they violated those protocols. Now, what happens, I'm going to be out of time, so I'll leave it there. Some of those protocols are violated in this initial interview where aged Annas, as they are preparing for the main trial, which will come to after the break, after the quiz. I'll set you up for the quiz. But in this initial interview, Annas violated high-handedly protocols which were so precious and central to Jewish jurisprudence, and Jesus challenges him on it. He won't let him get away with it. And, I'll tell you, I'm going to get interrupted. First of all, Annas says, "Tell me about your teaching." And Jesus says, I've always taught in the marketplace and in the synagogue. Go ask the witnesses. He's just saying, that's your protocol. All right, real quickly. Then the guard standing there cuffs Jesus. And one of the protocols that was absolutely inviolable was that you never punish a man until he's been convicted of a crime. So Jesus turns to him and says, if I've done wrong, testify against me. But short of that, why would you cuff me? Now, that's all that happens. But it's just amazing to me. It's instructive to me how entirely in charge Jesus is. He's not uppity. He's not arrogant. He's just simply saying to Annas, you are under obligation to honor the biblical protocols of jurisprudence that you are dishonoring. That's all that happens. Then he is taken to Caiaphas. We'll pick that up next.